Okay, cool. So thank you so much, Maria, for organizing this. This is awesome. I love to be contributing to rethinking. And yeah, this is just, I think you had some to say first.
Yeah. Okay. So hello everyone that's watching this. This was supposed to be a session as part of the Rethinking Economies Festival for 2021. Unfortunately, online festivals have been very useful to connecting us to people abroad, but it also means that sometimes internet gets cut off. So we're giving this a second shot. We have with us Jose today. He's an economist from Latin America. I'm Maria. I will be hosting, recording, and hopefully uploading this to YouTube afterwards. So this session is about the present and future of informal economies. Jose has knowledge of both heterodox and orthodox economic theories. His knowledge applies to issues of development and informal economies. And what do we mean when we say informal economies? We usually talk about policy issues that have to do with informal economy, or we talk about the hardships informal workers face. So we'll talk about the reality of informal workers in Latin American countries for a bit. Jose is going to mention recent research on who these informal workers are or what activities they undertake. But more importantly, he's going to talk about the future and what we can do with this data now that we have it. So now that we know who's more likely to be informally employed and securely employed, what policy changes could be made to support informal workers and the communities they live in. So I'm going to ask Jose to start presenting. And then if you have any questions at the end of this, you can comment on YouTube, you can use Twitter, Rethinking Economics, and we'll get your questions to Jose, hopefully get some answers. So over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Maria. I appreciate that very nice introduction. So first things first, I would like to speak very briefly about informalization. This is a topic that has been following me throughout the entire writing the PhD process, and I'm a topic that I'm very passionate about because it's something that I literally have lived my entire life with, growing up here in Guatemala. So the way this presentation is going to be organized is first, I'm just going to present some of the observations I've made, then some of the reading you can find on this stuff, and where to look for sources. Third, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the measurement of informalization. What are the measurements telling us nowadays? What are they actually getting at? Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the inference you can make today with measurements of informalization and some of the factors that impact it at the national level, right, at the macro level. And some of the final insights I hope to leave for last. Hopefully you're still here by then. Now, first of all, I wanted to start with a very simple story. I lived in Colorado for around like 10 years of my life while I was completing the PhD. And I would travel back and forth from Colorado to Guatemala and back to Colorado. And whenever the airport doors open in Guatemala, the first thing you see about the Guatemalan economy as you come into the country is this image. Actually, I took this picture, right? And it's quite an interesting picture of the paradoxes that are involved in the case of informality. This lady is selling all sorts of cigarettes, candy, toys, and drinks, gum, all sorts of items in the middle of the airport in Guatemala City. And she's not the only one there. And she has not been the only one there for years, to the point that the airport actually put up these signs saying prohibited informal sales, or prohibido ventas informales, right? Which I find kind of weird. That's in English, because most of the people in Guatemala don't even speak English or understand it, right? But she's selling all these type of things in the airport, right? With absolutely no trouble, and everybody's buying, and she's basically going over a boundary. She's doing something that in technical terms is kind of illegal, but normatively everybody accepts it, and ultimately finds it convenient, right? So I wanted to talk when I started the PhD. I wanted to talk a little bit about this paradox about informality, right? Where even though everybody kind of looks at it as a very harsh development challenge, in a place like Guatemala is all over the place constantly, right? This is another example, right? These guys are selling iPhone cases and phone, like smartphone cases, and there is a sign there that says prohibited to locate sales here, and it's from the municipality of Misco, which is a city here in Guatemala, right? But what's fascinating is that those guys are like selling that, and people buy from them. If there's a supply, there is a demand right there for those iPhone cases. And I personally think it's a fascinating thing, and it's a paradoxical thing that so many people, right, are living in the informal economy. When you look at the news in Guatemala, right, any news about employment, about migration, um, we can see that the weight of the informal sector actually it's a very important aspect of Latin American development. And you see some of the best economies, like here, that's a picture of one of my good friends from here from Guatemala, one of the best economists I know, who speaks about like basically how important the problem of creating high quantities of high quality employment is impacting a lot of Latin American workers, to the point that one of the consequences of not developing decent formal sectors in terms of employment is what everybody already knows, right? These humongous caravans with thousands and thousands of people trying to migrate north through different routes, simply because they don't find an opportunity around, and the best opportunities are typically in the informal sector, where you see more precarious job conditions, where you see lower incomes, where there is no access to social safety nets. So the topic really grasped me, and I started reading on it, and I stumbled upon a lot of the great literature in development economics. Among them, we can think of Albert Hirschman, a personal hero of mine, right? Like one of the best development economists of the last century. He was one of the first ones to speak openly about labor conditions here in America. Wrote Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Wrote The Rhetorics of Reaction. Wrote the Strategies for Development. All of those books I highly recommend if you're interested in this type of subjects. Then there is Hernando Desoto, right? Hernando Desoto is a great economist from Peru, who, as we'll see later on in the presentation, is one of those other countries that has very high levels of informalization of labor and informalization of economic activities, informalization of enterprises, and so on. And finally, one of the economists I truly admire nowadays, talking about the topic and of informality, job quality, policy, and structural change, is Danny Roderick, right? On your right. And Danny actually really has quite intensely discussed the impacts of the industrialization and structural change on in the inability of Latin America to develop high quality jobs. So if you look at this presentation, I would argue it's kind of like and my work, typically I take influences from these three economies. And the first thing I wanted to do, because it's the first thing I noticed about this literature, was to figure out kind of an archaeology, a very, very Michel Foucault type of deal, building the archaeology of the concept of informalization. Because one of the things I noticed was that throughout the development literature, not everybody is talking about the same thing when they talk about informality. And some people put more weight on certain things, some people put weight on other things. So what I really wanted to try to capture was this kind of evolution of the concept, and really kind of frame the concept of informality within economic history in a way that shows how dynamic really economic concepts and terms are. So if we look at the very early type of development work, right, even Arthur Lewis in his like seminal development economics paper from 1954, does talk about casual employment. He refers to it as casual employment, and he discusses all of the people who have like precarious jobs in cities, like helping you carry your bags or helping you doing like certain errands or very basic type of redundant type of jobs, right? Harris and Todaro, within their framework of migration to cities, and do develop the concept of informalization as this kind of surplus of labor. So, and Fields really perfects it by calling the informal sector the murky sector. But basically, what Fields does is just readapt the Harris and Todaro like basic model into a really discuss informalization within cities in Latin America. And that's a conception we have of informal economies, all basically from the 50s all the way to the end of the 80s. Now, around 1989, 1990, Desoto actually comes out, and he's writing together with Enrique Gersi. Enrique Gersi is a libertarian. Desoto is kind of like more of an heterodox Marxist type of economist, right? But Enrique Gersi is a very like right-wing libertarian, and it's an interesting contribution. If you ever get the chance to read it, I'm going to discuss a little bit more later in the presentation. But De Soto really pushes in this concept of looking at informalization as a problem of avoiding taxes, avoiding regulation imposed by different governments in different countries. So, from looking at casual employment, informality throughout the 90s and through the expansion of neoliberalism starts acquiring this kind of fiscal dimension, like regulatory dimension, in which what informals are people willingly exiting the system. Here, De Soto uses the theory from Albert Hirschman from Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And basically, he claims that a lot of informals basically are exiting the regulatory framework in different countries. Nevertheless, my argument throughout this whole presentation is that in order to exit a particular institutional system, first you have to be in, and it is no surprise to anyone that a lot of people are already excluded from regulatory legal systems in developing countries all over the world, right? So looking at informality from an exit perspective seemed to me a bit insensible, in the sense that it really didn't grasp the idea of this is actually low quality employment people who didn't really have another choice, right? And De Soto is actually assuming that they do have a choice. So I'm going to pay a little bit more of attention to this perspective, because I think it really shifted a lot of the conversation throughout the neoliberal era about informalization. Just as two examples, Loaiza from 1996 developed the concept of shadow economy, and it started becoming quite popular to the point that Schneider 2000 estimated shadow economies for the entire world. I'm going to get back to these points later on down the presentation, right? But it's just to show how influential this very tiny idea, this very tiny change in the idea about what informalization was actually had for fiscal problems around the world. And finally, what we see is, thankfully, a return to stop looking at informalization just as a fiscal regulatory issue, and start understanding it and start grasping it as a problem of quality of employment. So there we have multiple examples of this problem. Frenkel and Ross model using a little bit of Harris and Todaro influences, model growth macroeconomic models, implementing a lot of the influences from the earlier type of literature. Amin started doing a lot of microeconomic work using enterprise surveys. And finally, Roderick, 2009, really started discussing the problem of economic growth, economic policy, and quality of employment, which actually is, in my perspective, is centering the discussion about informality back again onto labor, back again onto the condition of workers around the world. Now, one of the important aspects of this whole process is to understand how De Soto actually described informalization, right? And basically what he claims is that there are three stages in the development of an informal economy. The first stage is the stage in which you get new workers in your economy. The second stage is that these new workers face some type of social exclusion. And the third case is how these excluded workers actually end up developing a lot of economic mechanisms, either through not respecting the rules, through exiting them, or through developing their own set of rules, right? And we basically legalize a norm or normalize law, right? But in either case, what we see on stage 3 is this process of exit. And what I did was basically turn it on its head and basically argue that the exit perspective is the one that's informing the shadow economy. And Schneider is and Weiss are not, not even Desoto. All of those guys are not shy about admitting that they are highly influenced by this idea of informal workers and informal economic agents voluntarily exiting the system to become informal. And thus, they tried to measure the degree of informalization at the macro level as indirectly, and they came up with all of these different concepts that we're going to go over briefly here, like the shadow economy, the hidden economy, underground economies. I mean, I don't mean to be too broad about this, and I understand that nowadays there are people specializing in all of this, but I think that one of the important aspects of this problem is to trace its origin, right? And the origin was, we're assuming that economic agents are voluntarily members of the shadow economy, right? The shadow economy is not composed by people who randomly end up there. And then we see all of these kind of more heterodox perspectives like Rodri or Desoto, who argue that there is this institutional dimension to informalization, right? In which, I'm sorry, not Desoto, like Roderick or Roberto Frenkel and Ross, right? Who see informalization as this institutional type of phenomenon, in which actually it's a problem, a development challenge, not really about people exiting the system, but it's about new economic agents, and it's about how are they excluded from formality. So to some extent, if you think about it, right, informalization very quickly, it's turning into this very ambiguous problem conceptually, in the sense that we don't really understand at this point in time if you have two competing views about informalization. If informal workers are really there because they're new workers, because they're excluded and discriminated against, or because they actually chose to leave the system. And my guess is that they're all of the above in a way or another, and that it really helps clear the map to see how different motivations actually end up providing you a large informal sector in a developing economy. So one of the things I really find fascinating is at some point in the PhD process, I even wrote a poem about it on all of the definitions that you can see of informal underground shadow economies type of deal. And Feihe in 1990 is actually a really good example of the tension that existed conceptually between the two sides, because he defines that there are illegal economies. He defines that there are unreported economies, right? People avoiding taxes, things like this. There are unregistered economies. Some people would locate in unregistered economies, the hidden economy, right? Like household economies and things like that. But it is fascinating to read his definition of informal economy, because in his definition of informal economy, he claims that informal economies are those that involve actors who evade costs and are excluded from protection of laws and regulation, blah, 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 blah. And here, I want to just pause a little bit and just focus on how ambiguous that is, right? You're either evading the costs of formality or you're excluded from formality, right? Like one of those two seem to me like they leave again informal economies conceptually ambiguous. And this is something I really wanted to highlight throughout the whole process, because I think that if we're really going to start understanding informalization in a more sensible way about development, we need to kind of start working on what are the motives of people behind the informal sector. And this I say in a context of what Roderick would call a structural change, right? In which what we see in the development process, according to Roderick, is that ideally people in the process of structural change, if they were going to take the normal path that developed countries took, they would go from agriculture, from the agricultural sector to a manufacturing sector, from to service. And at some point, they would go from the informal sector to the manufacturing sector. And in that process, they would become organized and they would formalize. But what we actually see in the real world is that very often informal agriculture is passing directly to informal services, such as the retail we saw in the beginning of the presentation in the pictures, right? And what I think is important, right, is that also the moment that informals pass from agriculture to manufacturing, very often that manufacturing is still performed in under informal rules and under no kind of oversight from governments and stuff like that. So really, the process of formalizing the informal, once you look at the data and once you actually are able to capture and see what's actually going on the ground in different countries, that process actually really never took place. The process of formalizing informal workers coming from agriculture to other sectors of the economy. So to some extent, the next question really becomes, what should we be betting on in terms of structural change? Because nowadays we do see that, for instance, developed economies, right, went from agriculture to big manufacturing in terms of structural change, right? This is factories in England, factories even in the Meiji reforms in Japan, right? The agricultural sector passed to an industrial sector and formalized via the process of industrialization. Nevertheless, now we're seeing in developing economies that people are passing from the informal sector sometimes to manufacturing, like in China, for instance, but sometimes also to services that are not looking that different and that dissimilar from manufacturing, right? And in some cases, they formalize, like say in the case of call centers and stuff like that. In some cases, they don't, right? And I would say this slide really summarizes the processing of structural change in an interesting way, in the sense that it compares the picture from above is from Manufacturing Landscapes, the documentary, and it's in China, right? It's a factory in China, and it shares a lot of elements with the picture from below, which is from India, right? And in India, what you see is a lot of call centers and a lot of services being exported. Nevertheless, when you look at China, right, the agricultural sector passing to manufacturing, we see also an increase in the middle class and so on, a decrease in informalization. In India, that has not been the case. Adopting the strategy of going from agriculture to service without industrializing actually has not solved a lot of problems regarding poverty, regarding quality of jobs. India today still has the poorest cities in the world, and it still has a lot of informal labor all over the place, right? So I think this gives us a setup, right? In terms of, if you read about informalization, I think it's very important to contextualize it within the framework of structural change. And this is something that my work actually attempts to do. Now, if we look at the third point, I wanted to get to discuss a little bit about what can macroeconomists measure on informalization. And very quickly, I found that there are two large approaches. The first one is an indirect measurement, and typically it's influenced highly by the whole exit, voice, and loyalty perspective, and it tries to measure the people who exited the formal system by choice. Typically, these people use the mimic method, which basically is a method of the structural model of equations, in which on one side you have the indicators that tell you how much informalization you're going to find in a particular economy. Then on the other side, you have what are the potential causes that give you informalization, and informalization gets measured comparatively between countries, using all sorts of approximations with GDP, using the monetary theory, like the theory of money, and all sorts of very kind of ambiguous steps to get at this very nuanced idea of the shadow economy. In short, basically, you get this latent variable called the shadow economy, right, where you apply causes and you apply different indicators of what might give you a larger shadow economy, like low employment rates, changes in M1, because it's assumed, according to this stuff, that according to the theories, that informalization only works in cash, right? And the economic growth rates as indicators. But in the causes, you can very quickly start noticing the influence of neoliberal type of thinking in the measurement of the shadow economy, right? In the sense that taxes and regulation, economic freedom, business freedom are all different factors considered to be influencing the shadow economy. Now, beyond that, one of the things that I think it's very crucial, right, is that this allows you to develop different measurements for shadow economies, right? And as a matter of fact, now these measurements do exist virtually for the entire world. You can even work with panel data and panel data analysis on shadow economies. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize its limitations. Focusing on the Latin American case, these are the most updated versions I found of the shadow economy. This is from a paper from Schneider and Medina from 2019. And they show that those are averages from 1990 to 2015. My home country, Guatemala, has 54% of shadow economies. Some countries like Bolivia, you look at 62.28% of the economy as a percent of GDP measured in terms of the shadow economy. And yeah, you can basically plot these in different time series. These are the separate time series of measurements of shadow economies for those 15 years, or I'm sorry, for those 25 years, right? And you get pretty complete panel type of analysis. Nevertheless, even though this shadow economy measurement is really complete, it doesn't really tell you a lot of elements of what it's assuming when it's measuring the shadow economy. For example, it's not a very robust measurement if you change what the indicators and the causes of the informal sector are in terms of the mimic modeling process. It also assumes that the mass of cash is equivalent is equivalent to what the informal economy will use in an economy. And I think that that's M1, right? And it assumes that the size of the informal economy is going to be directly correlated to this measurement. And mostly, I would argue, one of the largest problems of shadow economies are that they're focused on stage 3, right? On the stage that involves exiting the formal economy, but is not focused or not telling you that much about either new workers or discriminatory processes going on in an economy that give you large informal sectors. For that reason, I decided that it would be appropriate to look at other types of measurements of informal economy. And there we can discuss a little bit about direct methods of looking at informalization, including employment measurements, measurements about firms, measurements directly in each country with censuses and central banks. I included the Vanguard here because they have their own type of measurement. We're going to get to look a little bit to it. And also different type of surveys, right? The NA, the ENCOVI, those are national surveys here in Guatemala with respect to employment and with respect to social security affiliation. And you can do exactly the same type of work. For instance, I'm going to focus right now on sepals measurement of informalization, which is one of my favorites. Sepal argues that an informal worker is someone in aggregate employment that is in the urban sector, right? And it's typically assumed to have low productivity, typically excluded from social safety nets. And they include in their measurement basically 3 big categories, basically micro businesses, people who are self-employed, and people in domestic employment. So with that, you can already actually start doing a lot of data work. For instance, if you look at urban informal employment from 1990, to 2014 in Latin America, right? Very similar measurements than what we see in the shadow economy, right? We see a more direct measurement in Guatemala. We're looking at that at the idea that 56% of workers are actually in the informal sector. Peru is looking at 61.88. Colombia, basically 2 out of 3 workers throughout these 25 years were in the informal sector. Bolivia is not looking that dissimilar, right? So I guess kind of what I'm trying to get at is that if you have these direct measurements that capture this whole idea of informal exclusion and the idea of new workers, I would argue that informal employment probably might be a better measurement to capture this type of stuff. And again, you can look at the series, right? You can develop series. These series are not as complete as those for the shadow economy, but these series are important because we're going to be using them to run some regressions and stuff like that. But one of the things I think it's quite fascinating, right, is that because these measurements are composite measurements of different sectors of employment on these countries, we can actually start splitting them. Like, for instance, I did the averages for 20 years from 1990 to 2010 of micro employees, micro employers, domestic servers, domestic service, and independent workers for the I did it for all different countries, right? But this gives you a very nice kind of like a very nice picture of the informal sector. And we would expect that those in the micro employers section are going to be those informal workers, mostly attributed to this whole idea of entrepreneurial informal work and to this kind of exit type of approach to informalization, right? And if you notice, in all of the cases for all of the countries, actually they represent quite a minority of people in the informal sector. Most of the people in the informal sector are independent workers or micro employees. So if we think about informals as people who exit, you're really looking at a minority of informal workers in that context. Now, in terms of the current consensus about informalization and looking at some of the presentations done by Rethinking, I noticed that today people really focus on either the hidden economy, looking at household work, casual labor. A lot of people in the gender literature have been incredibly important, talking about household work and the hidden economy. And also, I would argue that informal labor and employment and informal enterprises also present very important aspects of informalization. Now, looking at the macro picture and moving on just from measurement to try to run some inference and try to do some economic, more serious economic analysis about informalization, I wanted to start with this little cartoon. This is actually a Christmas card that Albert Hirschman sent to all his family and friends. And it says, "An excellent food is the banana. Let's eat it today and plan it mañana." And basically what he was trying to get at is this whole idea of, well, a lot of development issues have to do with relying on bananas and not necessarily planning to obtain better, higher quality and higher quantities of employment, but actually relying on commodities at the international level to basically keep their economies afloat. And in the case of Guatemala, I thought it was fascinating that in Colorado, I was eating Guatemalan bananas. They were gorgeous bananas, right? And one of the interesting things I saw in them was finding the ships from the Empire on Star Wars, basically stamped on the bananas that I was eating there, right? Just as a kind of marketing scheme, right? But what I found fascinating, right, was that how much this is speaking to this whole idea of how important it is for the rest of the world that we stay the banana producers, right? I was eating the highest quality bananas from Guatemala in Colorado all throughout the PhD, right? And the question is, what happened to our industry? Why aren't our workers basically working at factories and at industrial sectors as we would have seen in, say, Manchester in the 1800s or in Japan, right, in the 1800s? But what we actually saw in Latin America was this whole deindustrialization process in which basically a lot of big firms were cut off from Latin America, moved on to Asia, leaving a lot of informal workers in informal services like retail, like the guy on the right on this picture, right? Basically, with very low quality of employment, right? So, in more theoretical terms, what I was really talking about from a development economics perspective was Dutch disease, and this whole idea that Dutch disease does prevent structural change, and the way in which Dutch disease prevents structural change has impacts on the quality of employment and economy can develop. So basically, the whole logic of the model goes as follows. Basically, you have a composition of experts in which you have a resource course like bananas or palm oil or any agricultural good that basically develops really nicely here because you have nice weather all throughout the year, right? And a lot of the real exchange rate policy, that's the Dutch disease part, right? Real exchange rate policy is going to be oriented to benefit the producers in the local economy, providing this type of commodities over manufacturing commodities to the rest of the world. So basically, we benefit agricultural producers at the opportunity cost of not benefiting industrial producers, particularly through real exchange rate policies. It's not coincidence that, for example, the Chinese economy has been very careful about how they manage the real exchange rate because they know it's crucial to be able to develop high quality jobs and industrial employment. Nevertheless, in Latin America, this has not been the case, right? In real exchange rate policies has been oriented to basically the encouragement of the usage of commodity prices to get out of different crises. And with this, what we see is basically style non-existent industrial development or deindustrialization itself. And with that, that gets connected with all of the migrant workers coming from the agricultural sector who do not find a job in the rural sector or the agricultural sector, coming to cities and not finding factories that can employ them. So they become surplus urban labor that turns into this informal labor. So there is a linkage in this literature between resource course real exchange rate policy, the Dutch disease, how Dutch disease is being managed to not produce the type of structural change these economies need, and in turn, the lack of ability of these economies to not produce quality employment. So what I started looking for were all of these different very, very formal models. This is where Frankel and Ross, Chilean and Mexican economies working together on this problem came up with their model in which they implement going back, not looking at informalization from a fiscal perspective, but from a very much development classical perspective, implementing a horizontal type of modeling to growth models, right? And from these type of models, you can actually start developing a supply of labor type of equations that give you a hint of what factors might be associated with informalization. One of the things we find, right, is that higher income inequality, according to the model, gives you higher degrees of labor, informal labor supply, higher growth, higher economic levels, right? It gives you lower amounts of informal sector supply, but also one of the nice aspects of Frankel and Ross's model is that they originally were looking at the effects of real exchange rates on unemployment, but as an offshoot, they end up linking this macroeconomic policy to informality. So what I started doing was actually grabbing all my data on informalization, grabbing on all the annual data that exists on production inequality and exchange rates, and plugging them into an equation and seeing empirically how well do these variables perform in predicting in forecasting informal sectors in 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 different Latin American countries. And to no one's surprise, right, the informalization measurement used in terms of informal labor, right, the one I just presented from the sepal, actually gives us a positive association with all of the inequality measures that I had available, right? So the Gini coefficient, the Palmer ratio, and it gives us a negative association with GDP per capita or urbanization rates as proxies for economic development, right? But the other fascinating thing I found, right, that was that more competitive real exchange rates, basically real exchange rates that not benefit commodity prices, but that should benefit industrial development, is also associated with lower levels of informalization. We can see the correlations in the first column of this table, right? And then it just ended up being a problem of figuring out how robust these correlations and associations were, right? So it is at this point that I started running all sorts of fixed effects and random effects regressions. And to no one's surprise, right, we see that these associations hold for both inequality and controlling for inequality, controlling for GDP, but also GDP per capita, right? But also controlling for a lot of other factors like industrial employment, government social spending, which actually has a negative association with the level of informality, right? How much industrial employment you have, the trade volume, right? And all of these work as different types of controls, right? Just to show that real exchange rates remain pretty robust in terms of showing this association that I'm capturing in terms of commodity prices, commodity price driven policy, and low quality of employment. I just left this table here to show the first difference, right? To show that even if you first difference all of the factors, right, we still get the same type of associations, right? Just deal with stationary issues and all sorts of econometric problems, right? But I think that the moral of this story, right, is that something along the lines of different countries managing their macroeconomic policy to continue in the commodity price problem, in the Dutch disease problem, in the resource cores, is actually one of the offshoots of that issue is giving us large levels of informalization, and that's associated with low quality employment, right? Secondly, the other type of analysis that I did was in terms of enterprises, right? And here is where I looked at the more micro type of literature. I found this kind of like jewel in terms of data, in which in 2010, the World Bank did the World Enterprise Survey, but they designed it in a way in which they were going to be doing actually two surveys, one for formal workers, one for formal enterprises, one for informal enterprises. And what's fascinating about that approach is that it allows you to get very close. Like I would see basically no other type of surveys designed specifically for informal businesses in two cities in Guatemala, one in the capital city, Guatemala City, and the other one in the rural sector, Quetzaltenango, right? And what's fascinating about that approach, right, is that they got very, very close to ask very kind of like important questions about informalization. So again, I decided to approach this issue from a perspective that looks at informal economic activities and enterprises far from underground, far from exiting or avoiding regulations, but actually legitimated by customs and norms practiced by many Guatemalans, like the lady at the airport, right? Even if the rule says you should not sell anything here, everybody there in the Guatemala economy is buying from her and she's selling, right? Now, I decided I wanted to adopt this method because I did not want it to just look at informalization as just another dummy variable, as Folpre and Nelson would put it, but I wanted to be able to look at informalization from a more sophisticated perspective. So what I decided was to adopt approach that gender economists are using to study wage inequality. And instead of looking at wage equations, right, what I would do is look at output of firms to see how the determinants of productivity were impacted depending of business being formal or informal, but also at the structural level, I wanted to get at just how much informality actually explains the difference between the two sides, right? So it's informality doesn't work just as a dummy variable, because we're assuming that the slopes of the two curves actually are also changing in time, right? And what I would do is basically compare formal and informal firms to see what aspects of the differences in productivity are explained due to differences in inputs in production, and what aspects are just solely explained because the firms were formal or informal. And the results I'm about to show you, right, are based on very conventional Cobb-Douglas type of production functions. I tested the normal classical Cobb-Douglas per worker production functions. I also worked with a specification of a production function suggested by Amin, in which we control for the size of the firm by assuming that labor is a good measurement, the amount of workers a firm has is a good measurement of that. We have like in total we see up to 217 formal firms and 154 formal firms. This math is just to show all of the different factors I consider as different size of inputs. But in terms of results, right, what I would do is basically look at the number of workers, the value at the time of the survey in 2010 of their capital, right? The number of years of education to control for human capital. And then what we have below here is all sorts of different dummy variables that specify if a firm is in manufacturing or in services, if it has a female owner, if it's in Guatemala City or Quetzaltenango, if it had trouble getting electricity, if it had trouble with crime, corruption, finance, land, and the last one is the dummy for informal, just for the pool case. So if you look at the last column, you would be looking at just the dummy case, right? But what's important about the Oaxaca blinder approach to the productivity of firms, right, is the numbers below, right? How much is explained by differences in factors of production? How much is explained solely by the fact that firms are formal or informal? So if you look at just output in terms of sales, the differences between a formal and informal sector firm are between that are explained just by being informal is around between 21 and 25%, more or less, if we just look at the net productivity of firm. However, if we look at productivity per worker, informal firms are actually, once accounting for the size of the firm and so on, basically informality determines the productivity per worker measured as sales per worker, right? Basically 65% is on explaining that difference. In the best case scenario, up to 68% once we control for all of the other factors. And what this is basically telling us, right, is that even though it doesn't make that much difference for a firm, for a single firm, in terms of productivity to be formal or informal, in terms of the productivity per worker, it makes a huge difference if that worker is operating in an informal firm or a formal firm. So if you think about it, in countries where we have up to 60%, 66% degree of informality, that implies that the productivity of that 66% it's by far way lower than in the informal sector than the formal sector, meaning that this intuition that these developing economies are losing productive capacity due to informalization holds, right? Now, I'm not going to get too much in depth. If you have more questions about the approach and stuff like that, I'm willing to send you the paper and stuff like that, right? But what I did wanted to get is that this is a type of data work that I think can be done nowadays to really start better understanding how economics in the mainstream setup is a bit limited to really understand differences and the implications of having large sectors of large sections of your population in the informal sector. Now, moving a little bit beyond this stuff, right? We can look at other types of measurements. I said that I was going to be looking at surveys dealing with people, right? So one of those surveys is the national census in Guatemala. This is data from 2010 to 2019. And what's easy to see there in this data, right, is that around one fourth of the economy in terms of the census in Guatemala of the economically active and productive people, right? The PEA in población económicamente activa or actively economic population, right? One fourth is actually affiliated to some sort of social security. That means that if you go to Guatemala and you grab a random worker, there are 3 in 4 chances that that person is in the informal sector, not affiliated to any type of social security, right? That's affiliation to the IGS, which means Instituto Guatemalteco de Seguridad Social. One of the most fascinating aspects of this type of data is that it allows you to cut very thinly to see other types of properties. For example, this is a graph showing for 2018 people who are occupied between 15 and 64, but it gives you different levels of education. And what you can see is people who have a master's degree are around 3 in 4, right, with a master's degree. Are actually people who are affiliated to some sort of social security. Nevertheless, people with master's degree represent 0.36% of the entire economically active population in Guatemala, meaning very tiny percent of people, a very tiny sector, right? If you do not have any type of education, right, you represent to the 10.98% you see there. If you have a little less than primary education, you're on that 37.75, right? And in those cases, we see that the minority of people are affiliated, meaning the more the more educated you are in a country like Guatemala, the more part of the minority you are, the more likely you are going to be affiliated to Social Security. Nevertheless, what we see is that the majority of people are actually excluded from this type of organizations. So with that, we can go back to our 3 influencers, right? And ask ourselves, what would they say today if they were to look upon informal sectors in Latin America, and how have they evolved in the past, say, 30 years, right? And starting with Hirschman, I just want to quote him on the book that influenced the Fiscal Perspective, which is the perspective that assumes informal workers are there by choice, right? For an individual, a pattern of change in the Andes is to leave the rural community, reject the indigenous past, and assume all possible status symbols of mestizos. The individual who becomes mestizo in this way becomes part of the despised minority of cholos in a world dominated by urban upper classes to which he cannot aspire. Hirschman himself in this quote basically shows us, right, that in terms of our strategy to economic development, we cannot solely look at exit, that the exclusion aspects and the new workers aspects of looking at informality are incredibly important, and that they cannot be neglected, that we cannot continue assuming informalization is just about people deciding to leave the formal sector via freedom and via like a freedom of choice and a free choice of exiting the formal sector, but that there is all of these type of structural mechanisms that get in charge of discriminating against new workers, and that we are not developing any type of mechanisms to integrate new workers into urban, modern, developed parts of our countries, but actually that we have a lot of ways in which we can exclude them and discriminate against this type of new workers. Desoto, a little bit more contextualized in the context of the pandemic, basically talked to Radio Exitosa in 2020 and basically claims that what happens with the informals is this, right, is that they are the most humble people, the poorest people. Those people are basically in much more higher probability of contagion of the disease, right? And that they're more likely to die from the economic consequences of the disease too, right? and that the so-called informals have exhausted their savings during the literally the first months of the pandemic, and all of these type of pushes towards closing the economy and things like this are not considering that a lot of informal workers in many countries in Latin America, the majority of workers are dependent on going to work in the informal sector daily. They depend that for making a source of income, for being productive in this economy, for having a job in these type of economies, right? And if we think about it, for providing for their people, right? So one of the things that I think is interesting about Desoto's perspective is that even though he was highly influential in the exit perspective, he's also an economist that's claiming, well, informality is, just as Hirschman says, a systemic very problem, and is not isolated to a particular place, right? These type of problems can happen anywhere in the world. It's just that in my research I focus on Latin America. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about Roderick's perspective, right? And Roderick actually argues that anyway, you can industrialize and follow the steps of, say, for instance, China or Taiwan. Latin American economies need to do that to stop the type of toxic policies that are just planned towards servicing people using commodity prices to get ahead based on them owning land or renting out of selling goods and commodities in particular around the world. That's not actually developing our economies, but what we actually need to do is to go through this path of industrialization. Here, a lot of people argue, well, you have not considered that if you industrialize, you have a lot of environmental challenges going on and stuff like that. Believe me, it's way much more environmentally damaging for everyone to continue in the dirty agricultural commodity price rentist type of economies we have currently than actually industrializing. You can industrialize producing solar panels, producing clean energy. You don't need to think of industrialization as a challenge to environmental goals. I think we should start looking at it as more as a complement, because the mechanisms of remaining in an agricultural commodity-based economy tend to typically be actually worst for the environment. Like, say, if you look at the amount of square miles being torn away for palm oil or bananas in Guatemala, it's an ecological disaster, right? So I think it's important to highlight that even though I claim industrialization is very important for Latin America, that is not that is actually consistent. Industrializing is consistent with environmental policy. Also, I think that it's very important to start looking at, given that the path that we're following, basically it's so much directed towards services that it's incredibly crucial, according to Roderick, to look at services with high productivity outcomes that can provide you a lot of high quality jobs. Say, services like education or healthcare are both important aspects that where we can start integrating people from both the formal and informal sector to higher quality jobs that I think they have been quite overlooked all over Latin America, right? Like we don't really have a large, for instance, in Guatemala, we could have a more solid public university system that's not centralized in the capital city, but it's all over the country, right? And if you look at the evolution of what Guatemala has done since 1991 to 2019 in terms of the shape of our structural change, I estimated that basically what this graph is showing you to the right is an analysis like Roderick's analysis of structural change, in which what we see is most of the change in the Guatemalan economy has been due to people moving into services and increasing the productivity within services. And that has happened at the opportunity cost of losing productivity in industry. Even some people, but very little, have moved to industry, and losing productivity in agriculture. So services is actually the way we are developing, not necessarily industrializing. And my question, or what I want to leave the audience with is this actually something that's going to get people out of poverty, right? Because as we saw in the case of India, they're still having a lot of challenges with that. Last but not least, I think it's very important to be aware of the robot. According to Roderick, right, the largest challenges for quality of employment in the future are not only coming from your structural change position, are also coming from AI, are also coming from automatization, right? So I think it's very important to start a conversation about informalization with automatization and AI as potential substitute for workers, right? Finally, I wanted to have two different types of conclusions. The first one is that when we think of informalization, I think we need to translate that conversation into a conversation about exclusion, but not just about exclusion, right? We need to figure out practical macroeconomic policies, such as what if we manage our real exchange rate in a better way, right? Like macroeconomic policies that are practical, that can get us through evolving through the process of structural change. We should not avoid structural change, right? Hirschman reminds us of exclusion, right? Desoto reminds us of what macro policies could do to ameliorate the lives of informal workers. And I think structural change needs to be studied in more depth if we are going to resolve the problem of informalization in the region. Just to leave you as insights, I think that informalization, both theoretically and empirically, and this work kind of shows what you can do nowadays with that, needs to be associated with other aspects of economics, right? With macroeconomic policies, with meso and microeconomics, such as issues of productivity, right? I understand that there is a lot of unfairness going on. I understand that there is a lot of social category inequality problems in the issue of informalization, but I think that it is crucial that we also focus on how informals play a role as productive economic agents within these economies. I think informalization also has a dimension in terms of knowledge, of figuring out what is going on in these economies and what should be going on in terms of positive and normative economics. And there are tons of types of policies that we can really implement, from the technological to the environmental, to how are we dealing with globalization, with labor standards, with social safety nets, all sorts of practical macro policies that can be targeted to figuring out the informal sector and how to ameliorate its impacts on these economies, right? That we cannot really just stay at categorizing and describing the informal sector, but that we need to a little bit get our hands dirty in terms of social economic policy, right? To be able to kind of to deal with informalization. So without anything further to say, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to see if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jose. That was great. Very, very interesting. So I have a few questions. This was very exciting. It was a very private lecture for me only. So I'm going to take advantage of that and ask my questions. So I really appreciated how you talked about at the beginning the historical trajectory of these terms and the theories that go into talking about the informal economy and the development. I'm not objective when we're talking about this. I'm an economic historian, so I think history is really important. You know, knowing the context, knowing the context where things were developed helps understand how we came to have those theories and not other ones. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask was, you mentioned that yourself, but also I've seen it in the literature when I was trying to react myself. There's not a lot of clarity around the terminology, like when do we use the term shadow economy, or when do we use informal economy? When do we use moral economy? Because that means something different. I found out recently, if you're an economist or if you're a historian, moral economy can be used to describe a lot of different things. So I was wondering if you had some working definitions, not like a dictionary kind of definition on when you would use different terms, what kind of activities that would entail.
Okay, so hear me out. I think that the key element here is really what do you want to focus on when you're doing economic analysis, right?
Mm,
And I think that each term is going to be appropriate for different things. It's not that one is incorrect and the other, because they're all concepts, and concepts are not really, I don't know to what extent. It's more kind of the how we use those words and how those words help us think about a particular topic. Now, what I knew I wanted to do in this type of research is talk a little bit about macroeconomic policy, right? And one of the things I noticed very early on is that when you look at macroeconomic policy, you have fiscal policy, but if you're talking about informal workers, they get different government spending and typically they don't pay taxes.
mhm,
So there is a very different thing going on in fiscal policy if you have a lot of informal workers, right? Monetary policy, think about really the real interest rate, right? If you have a lot of informals, you clearly are not going to have the same type of financial banking systems and thus the same type of real interest rate, right? What do informals use that everyone else in the economy also uses? And that is currency.
mhm,
The type of macro policy that binds the entire economy together in a developing economy is your real exchange rate, simply because everybody in Guatemala uses quetzales. Everybody in Mexico uses pesos, right? Now, what am I connecting that whole way of thinking in terms of macro too? And I wanted to continue in macroeconomic terms, right? And what to me, the most important aspects in macro, if you come from a development political economy orthodox perspective, has to do with employment. But one of the things I found out very early on was that all of the employment concepts that existed in macro terms were relating to quantity of employment.
mhm,
And what I found out that was that informalization, urban informalization, can serve to some extent as a proxy to the quality of employment, right? So in that sense, that's why I use the sepals concept of informality. Does that make sense? Because I wanted to grasp how macro policy is linked with quality of employment
mhm,
in this context, right? Some other people may want to figure out how much don't we know about developing economies. And for that, I would argue go with the shadow economy. I think it's a great method to figure out how ignorant we are about economies that we're observing, right? I think you could work that out, right? Maybe change the cost and see how they change in the mimic method, like do some fancy statistical work so that it's robust and it's clear. But what I'm claiming is I do not think that there is this one single working definition of informalization that's going to serve as an overall really good like concept for every single aspect of informalization, right? Then on the second part of my present and the third part of my presentation, I talked a little bit about microeconomics, right? And there I wanted to talk about productivity. I think productivity is very nicely measured if you are looking at businesses and not necessarily people. I think measuring productivity is very tricky when you're looking at people because there is a lot of work that doesn't get paid or measured that is still productive work. Say making a meal, right? While if you're looking at businesses, comparable businesses with comparable criteria measured at one point in time, but one of them are formal, some of them are formal, and some of them are informal, you can start measuring the different impacts of productivity. And it ends up working out that enterprises are a nice way of measuring productivity, right? So I guess kind of conceptually, it has to do more with what on the abstract, on the philosophical aspects of the economics that you're doing, what concept you use, right? We should use concepts to develop our thinking and not like backwards that concepts basically ingrain our thinking, right? I think that's a part of having this kind of like pluralist, orthodox perspective on this stuff. I don't know if I answered your question, but I thought it was a cool question.
oh, thank you. Yeah, you did answer. I think that's where I'm leaning towards as well, using what's
Mhm.
most suitable to the question at hand. I'm going to continue with questions based on how well you put in there some history and some context. So the next one was that I also liked that you talked about how we have this timeline in mind. People were working in the informal economy, and then industrialization came along, and then their jobs became formalized, and how that kind of only relates to countries in the global south like England or the Netherlands, and that's not really the case for other countries. It was definitely not the case for my country. I'm from Greece. That's not what happened ever. So I like that.
And it got worse after 2007, like, right? Like, I'm a big fan of Yanis Varoufakis' look on Greece, and it's just like, ouch, that was horrible.
There's also a question of, did we ever get a fully industrialized economy that could then be deindustrialized? And a lot of people claim that no, actually, we didn't. And how that connects to the fact that workers don't always have a choice. How mainstream economics have this obsession with freedom of choice, and people are making informed decisions when, again, not the case in the real world. So I had a question there, and I'm not going to talk about the models that you use because I'm a historian. I'm hoping some macroeconomists will have comments on those, and we can get a discussion going on YouTube. But considering
That's
the
good.
people that are usually informal workers, and how that might be women that don't have access to formal employment, or it might be people that don't have legal status in a country. So basically that they can only be informal workers. And a lot of the data that is used comes from formal sources, comes from the ILO, comes from the World Bank, comes from censuses. How do you deal with a lack of reliable sources, or how do you deal with the fact that informal workers might be hesitant to answer, to reply to surveys because they might not be in the country legally? How do you deal with that when you're trying to develop?
I think that's the challenge of every development macro person, right? Like, you are always going to be limited in the amount of inference you're going to be able to make. And I think that as Hayek would put it, we should be humble about it, right? Like, we should be kind of humble about how much you get to know the nitty-gritty details of, say, a domestic service worker working in a middle-income house in the middle of Guatemala City, right? Like, sometimes I think even at the epistemological level, you're better off, if you want to look into that stuff, not using macro data, but looking at kind of what you do, like historical case studies of this type of people. It's just simply more scientific to go about it that way than looking at the macro part. To me, I like data and I like macroeconomics because I am interested a little bit, not solely on the standpoint epistemological perspective of a particular economic issue, but I also like the whole analysis of trends, right? This whole idea that I'm never going to be able to know reality, but that there are aspects of reality that do show up in the data you have, and that we have to be extremely careful of that, right? I think that's the magical realist in me, being Latin American and loving Garcia Marquez and Julio Cortázar, right? But I think that the magical realist in me tells me that what data does is it doesn't give you the truth. It gives you always part of the truth, as Esther Duflo puts it, right? But I think it does give you some insights about what's going on at the macro level. There, I would recommend one of my grad school profs' advice, right? Follow the 4 C's, right? Make data consistent, comparable, complete, and coherent, right? And don't focus on, is there 66.63% of informal workers in Guatemala? No, we don't care about that number, really. What we do care is if 30 years ago, they were 66.632, right? Or if 30 years ago, the same measurement shows that they were 84 or they were 20. because that's what gives you, I think, the appropriate macroeconometric insight that people are actually looking for, right? And also, I do think that using data can give you more traction within policy prescriptive circles. It gives you a little bit of more credibility as opposed to a case-by-case basis, simply for the fact that policy is typically a public good, right? It's not done policy, and I don't think it should be done on a case-by-case basis, right? That's too much room for privilege and corruption and stuff like that, right? So if you think about it, I'm not definitely someone who is like, and probably a lot of heterodox economists are going to be like, oh no, you need to do history. I get that perspective too. I like postmodernism, the postmodern condition by Lyotard and all that stuff, right? But I do think that data does serve a purpose, right? And it gives us a basic macro picture of to get insights, right? I don't think we should, as heterodox economists, be entirely dismissive of the use of data. And in fact, I actually think that one of the nicest things about studying development today is that if you were to study it in the 80s, you had 4 observations year-wise, right? Today, you do have 40 observation series, sometimes even monthly, so it's huge data set. You do have success stories. You can learn from successes and failures, right? So I don't think we should dismiss it, right? If developed countries have been using data to establish macro policy, I think developing economies just should get on that boat too and try to develop macro policy, not solely based on politics at the moment, but on more trend observing educated people. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna ask you one last question. That's really 2 questions, because I'm trying to stick to the time frame that we had for the original session. And you mentioned that, like the first part of the question, you mentioned that as well, about AI getting involved in production and how that will impact people's jobs. And actually, it's one of the things that people send us a question it's wondering, since technology is replacing more jobs and enlarging the informal job market in the 21st century, what would be a solution to that? And I'm going to connect that to a question of my own. Again, coming from my own research experience, a lot of the traditional tasks that happen in an economy are happening in informal context. So you would get people selling food in the street or people taking care of other people. Those are not things that are done formally, they weren't done formally before neoliberalism. And there are some people that do raise the question of, should we aim to formalize these jobs? And since technology seems to be able to do more and more things for us, is there a point in formalizing, or should we try to find other ways to get informal workers access to social security? And do you think that universal basic income, for example, could be a solution here, or some similar policy that will help us, take care of the well-being of informal workers, while not being trapped into thinking we need to formalize employment to better living conditions?
Okay, so those were like 8 questions. I'm keeping track on I'm tallying them up here, right? But okay, so the first answer at first, like is I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? Like at first, I don't know. Like how do we make a labor amicable type of technological change? I want to meet more economists that provide an answer to that one to see how they're wrong. You know what I'm saying? Because like I don't think I'm not that good to be able to provide that answer, right? I have some ideas of things you could do, right? But I think that you touch on something that I think is important. when you ask your question about should we, given that we have this technological change and stuff like that, right? Should we formalize people? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by actually formalizing people, right? Do you mean that they should pay taxes now? Do you mean that they're also going to be in social security? Do you mean that they're going to have higher productivity working at a factory? Do you mean that they are not going to ever be excluded? Do you mean that I'm going to have to pay $10 every time my grandma makes me a sandwich? You see, like, I think it's a very tricky question, because and that's why I put so much emphasis on my taxonomy of concepts of informalization. People can use that in so many different directions that asking, hey, would you formalize what economic agent under what condition? You see what I'm trying to get at? I think it's not just a silver bullet, like we're going to formalize all developing economies and we're going to end world hunger. I think each particular sector of the economy, to some extent, needs to understand that formalization impacts them differently, right? For example, you were talking about some of the activities in the economy taking place in informal terms. An example was, I think, on the Daily Show a couple of years ago, on doctors receiving favors from pharmaceutical companies, eating lobster at a fancy restaurant so that they advertised their pharmacy. Should we consider that an informal economy? It's a favor. Like, everything is going on in a very non-business, very moralistic type of normative, non-market based type of deal, right? So to some extent, I mean, I'm a bit sorry to be so ambiguous. Maybe the postmodern is getting crazy right now, but I think that to some extent, my idea is that we should start thinking about informalization a little bit more as a consequence of misguided big macro policies about what's a role in the global economy as developing economies, and how are we dealing with our internal inequality problems, right? And I think that any type of policy that can align those type of incentives, be better with the world, but also improve conditions in here, should be an effort for formalizing. Am I seeing that different countries are doing this, especially under the crisis of the pandemic? My answer as a good economist would be no, right? Otherwise, if I didn't have a depressing answer, I wouldn't be a good economist, right? But I think that's one of the main issues, that we need to align those two, and a lot of that actually happens in the background. The big macro policies that are influencing certain sectors, not influencing other sectors. And I think we need to link up the informal street vendor to that stuff, because sometimes they're so far away from one another that you start seeing maybe what we should do is start taxing street vendors, right? Or we should take away their hot dog carts. And you very quickly realize that's a very bad idea. You're making a lot of people poor by doing that, right? So I think that linking those two, I think, is part of what my work is about. I don't know if I got at your 8 questions, but they were great. I like talking with you about this stuff. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
It's the academic in me. I'm really sorry. It's that thing you get at conferences. Hi, I have a question, and then 5 minutes later, the question has not been voiced.
That's a comment, not a question.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna stop asking questions because it's been over an hour.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for doing this. I hope that people will have questions of their own when they watch this, and we'll pose them to you. And I promise that we'll find a way to get the answers out.
Sounds good.
I have to plug, I think, our social media, so you can follow Rethinking Economics on Twitter, obviously on YouTube, Facebook. You can join our Slack channel for discussions and action circles around a lot of things. And it will be great to have you around for some of the things that we've planned for this year, which will probably be online. Hopefully some can happen face to face, but yeah, probably online, so we can get to all of you. And again, Jose, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Maria. I appreciate all of this.